And now in our Canberra studio, I'm joined by Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Heather. Good to be here.
Now, you were there today for those emotional words from the Prime Minister and from others in the House on both sides. Did that show to you that this is a time for bipartisanship instead of bickering over the flood levy and who can make the better cuts?
Well, there is bipartisanship. We support every dollar that's being spent by the government in their programs and in their intentions. We also support the vast majority of the government's cuts.
But you don't support the levy?
Because the levy is not only significant for households, it's the wrong time for Australia at the moment, Heather. You have depleted consumer confidence. You have rising interest rates. You have the government flagging a mining tax and a carbon tax. This is another burden on Australian households, and it's poorly timed, and it's going to have an impact.
Were you moved by what the Prime Minister had to say today?
I was moved by...
Did it bring a lump to your throat?
Oh, look, I was moved by all the speeches. Scotty Buckholtz, who is the member for Wrighton, covers the Lockyer Valley, gave a very emotional speech. And look, how can anyone not be moved when they hear of a young child making sacrifice of his life for his brother? I mean, you're not human if you're not moved by that sort of thing.
So at a time like this, isn't Australia bigger than that? Can't we afford, whatever it is, 1 cup of coffee a week for middle and high income earners to meet this levy and help pay for the flood damage?
Look,
have you misjudged the public mood?
No, we haven't. And Heather, look, we are doing what we believe to be right for Australia. And by outlining or giving significant detail today on our alternative savings in the budget, we are proving to the Australian people that we want to see the money spent. We do want to see every dollar spent. But the thing is, you can't go and hit those households that donated money and volunteered significantly to help those disadvantaged. You can't go and hit them again with a levy.
Well, before we go to some of the details of the package that you outlined today, former Finance Minister John Fahey clearly thinks the levy is good enough for him because he's prepared to oversee how it's spent. Is he the right man for the job?
Well, it just shows you that when the Labor Party wants to stop waste, it has to appoint a Liberal. And it's hugely insulting for Wayne Swan, who is meant to be overseeing the recovery effort. It's hugely embarrassing for him to have the Prime Minister then go and appoint a former Liberal Finance Minister to make sure he doesn't waste any money.
Is it embarrassing for you that a former Liberal Finance Minister has signed up for the job and clearly does support this levy?
Not at all. John Fahey is a very good man. He, like all other Liberals, knows how to count. And what we do is we're the party that stops waste. Clearly, Julia Gillard, in appointing a Liberal to stop the waste, is sending a message to the Australian people that she doesn't trust herself on the economy.
Let's go to the package now. There are an awful lot of deferrals outlined rather than actual cuts. Are you being a bit disingenuous there?
Well, if that accusation rings true with us, it rings true in a larger way with the government, because more than $1.5 billion of their so-called savings are in fact deferrals. So from our perspective, we've said we cannot continue with a number of programs whilst there is a greater demand to repair Queensland in particular and the rest of Australia more generally.
There wasn't exactly overwhelming agreement about this in the Shadow Cabinet meeting in the last few days, was there? There was, I gather, some heated argument over a suggestion that you could cut aid to Africa. That didn't go ahead, but instead you decided to move on aid to Indonesian schools. Is that really sensible when we're told that these schools can be a breeding ground for terrorists?
If I can make this point, every cut is difficult, but the government is spending over the next 4 years $1.5 trillion. The cuts that we've announced represent 0.1% of that $1.5 trillion. So from our perspective, Heather, we are doing what is right for Australia.
Is it fair, though, to the Indonesians, our nearest neighbours? Aren't we big enough? Are we in such dire straits that we can't continue to fund a program like this to Indonesian schools post the tsunami that was introduced under John Howard?
Well, if value for money is proven, and there is a review at the moment on that contribution, and I emphasise it's not part of the 2015 commitment on foreign aid, It is a separate additional commitment that Julia Gillard made last year. If it's proven, then we'll look at it again. But we cannot proceed with everything that everyone wants. I've been a member of, and Tony Abbott, together we've been 20 years on the Expenditure Review Committee of the government. No one ever walks out happy from budget cuts. Even those making the cuts are never happy about it. You do it because it's right for Australia, and that's what we're going to do.
But again, we're going to huffing and puffing over which side can make the better cuts at a time when the country has been through a summer of terrible disasters. Yeah. Have you really miscalculated this? Have you got it wrong, how you're dealing with and responding to this crisis?
Not at all, because we're supporting of... the government has cuts of roughly $3.5 billion. We're supporting, and we're not opposing, $3.2 billion of those cuts. The measures we are opposing are the stupid measures that the government has proposed to cut flood mitigation measures on the Bruce Highway. That's absurd, and clearly it's absurd. And the levy itself is the biggest levy ever imposed on the Australian people in a single year.
OK, just very, very quickly, if the flood damage does prove to blow out, and this often happens, are you going to have to announce more cuts? Where does this all end? Well,
this opposition has gone further than any opposition ever has, and we have laid down our plans to deliver a stronger economy. But I say to you, Heather, with rising interest rates, with rising inflation, and with the government flagging mining tax and carbon taxes, the flood levy is just dead wrong for the Australian economy.
I'd like to move to another matter briefly now before we close off. On Channel 7 tonight, they played footage from Tony Abbott's visit to Afghanistan late last year, where a US commander explained the circumstances surrounding the death of an Australian soldier. Let's just hear a little bit of that.
But we all live and learn. But all the stuff that you see here and more was available on the internet.
No, it's really obvious that
Yeah, look, you've taken this out of context. You weren't there. I would never seek to make light of the death of an Australian soldier.
Okay, well, tell me, what's the context? And if it's out of context, what is the context? You're not saying anything, Tony.
I've given you the response you deserve.
Was that an adequate response?
Look, Heather, I've known Tony Abbott for 20 years. I know when the suggestion was made that he trivialised the death of a digger, he would be mortified, absolutely mortified. His instant reaction has been to ring that digger's widow. He has spoken with her. That's where the matter should rest.
Did he exercise the best judgment in the way he handled the questions from that journalist today?
You know what, Heather, we can't control the way questions are asked, nor can we control the way that stories are framed. But I know Tony Abbott, he would be absolutely mortified. I know he is. I was with him. He is mortified at the suggestion that in any way he was disrespectful of the enormous sacrifice of an Australian digger.
Is there a pattern that you may be concerned about here in the way that Tony Abbott sometimes answers these questions from the media?
You know what? There's nothing confected about Tony Abbott. He doesn't stage manage things for the media. He is a real person. He has real feelings. And the fact that he had the first response of wanting to ring the wife of the digger who may have been offended, it just illustrates he is a very decent man and he has a very decent heart.
Joe Hockey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Heather.